And Melissa is the survivor of a failed saline infusion abortion. Despite the initial concerns regarding Melissa's future after surviving the attempt to end her life at approximately 7 months gestation, she has not only survived but thrived. Although the doctors initially believed that she would not live past her infancy, and if she did, she would suffer from multiple disabilities throughout her lifetime, she was adopted into a loving home as an infant, and she's not only survived but thrived. As Melissa will be sharing with us her life, her story is so much more than one of survival. Melissa's testimony speaks to the beauty of God's grace in our lives, about the power of love, about hope and healing in the midst of grief and loss, and about the transformational power of forgiveness and in answering God's call for your life. Melissa's perspective as an abortion survivor who has had contact with numerous members of her biological family as a mother herself highlights the intergenerational impact of abortion on families and communities, fulfilling the purpose that she believes God set out for her when he saved her from the certain death of the abortion attempt. Melissa is truly a voice for the voiceless. And so if we could together welcome Melissa Ohden.
This was a power-packed night, wasn't it? I mean, let's give everyone a round of applause who has shared, especially Father for leading us as well. I love being able to show up at an event and sit there thinking, they didn't even need me here tonight. So Sandy, thank you. You didn't even need me here tonight. And I was actually going to pull a Senator Ricketts and just jump up. But then I figured it might be a moment wasted because he had to leave in preparation for tomorrow. So maybe I'll just save that move for tomorrow, okay? You guys will know it when you see it. Nebraska has something very special. And I share this as someone who is from this area. You'll hear little bits and pieces here tonight of my own background and what brings me here. But I can tell you that as you gather here tonight, you have given me incredible hope. As someone who has a story to tell that has been touched by abortion, as someone who engages in international pro-life work, I can tell you that the landscape has shifted so dramatically. To lose 7 initiatives. Yes, I always have hope, even after every single one of those initiatives, because we know that this is between the battle of good and evil. We know who we are up against. And yet tonight, I can tell you that there is something in this room that I have not witnessed anywhere yet. Anywhere yet. And I was part of the first ballot initiative in Kansas for the Value Them Both initiative. The first loss for our nation post-Dobbs. So what I hope to do tonight is to inspire you. You have had so many incredible leaders tonight pouring knowledge into you. Senator Ricketts clearly giving you a call to action like he does so well. And what I can do tonight is to hopefully further inspire you, encourage you, not just with my story, but with my feedback for who I see you to be. I think Nebraska tends to be very underestimated. As an Iowa girl myself who now lives in Missouri, I feel like the entire Midwest is woefully underrated in general, isn't it? And I know Nebraska's sordid history regarding abortion and late-term abortion in particular, much like I know of Kansas's sordid history on those matters. And our states have been forever changed by abortion. But the reality is, it ends here. This is your battle. And you have been preparing for this moment in time. And so what I can see within you tonight, I hope is encouraging to you. Not just that you have something special, a state that is underrated, a state that is called to be in this place in this moment of time. This group of people who know and love one another in a way that Nebraskans do, but also, can I tell you that who I see you to be, and this is not a bad thing, so hear me out on this tonight. You are ordinary people just like I'm an ordinary person who, by the grace of God, is called to do extraordinary things. And so that's what I want to talk to you about. We'll see if I can cue up those first slides. Oh, I'm ahead of myself. I want to start tonight by sharing my birth mother's story, which ultimately becomes my story. You know, some of you know me from being involved in the pro-life movement now for nearly 2 decades. I spoke at an event, 12, 13 years ago. A long time ago here in Lincoln. In pro-life years, that's a long time. And I know many of you probably heard my story back then, but what I hope you find encouraging with my time with you tonight is that even since that moment of time, when I was here in Lincoln, God has continued to do extraordinary things in my life. Loose ends tied up, restoration, reconciliation, things that I never in a million years could have imagined would happen. And that is the hope that we have for you here in Nebraska. Those things that we hope for, pray for, work for, those things can happen because ordinary people just like you and me, by the grace of God, are called to do extraordinary things. My life story started not terribly far from here, Sioux City, Iowa, not Nebraska. How many people in our country don't even know that there is a North Sioux City, South Dakota? I mean, most, right? I mean, if we're being honest. I was even, if I'm being brutally honest, I was doing an audiobook version of my new book that was just released this month, Abortion Survivors Break Their Silence, with focus on the family in Tyndale. And you can imagine my panic. I'm sitting in a booth in December, right, trying to get through this audiobook reading as fast as I can, right? I don't enjoy it. And they knew that, right? Let me get this done. And I'm reading from my own book that I wrote and people edited, and I read, Melissa was born at St. Luke's Hospital in South Sioux City, Nebraska. And I went, oh, what? How did this happen? And of course the audio booth guy was like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but I'll go ahead and flag that. So that's how close my story starts to here in Nebraska. You know, it was certainly not a laughing matter back in 1977 when my birth mother, as a 19-year-old college student, found herself facing her unplanned pregnancy with me. And I know many details of her circumstances and mine, and really our family, is hard to hear. Even when we engage in this battle, when we come face to face with the flesh and bones of what abortion is and what it does, not just to the preborn baby, but to the women and to the families. Yes, I know it's hard to hear. But as I share this tonight, I want you to understand I share this for our need to know the truth about abortion and for us to be healed and equipped to continue to fight the battle. My birth mother and her family are so much like other families. You would have found them sitting next to you at church on any given Sunday. You would have found my paternal grandfather being very prominent in your community. He was a superintendent of schools. You would have found my grandmother educating nurses at a local nursing college. You would have seen her walking the halls of St. Luke's Hospital, where she worked, helping to deliver babies with a local OBGYN. And I will never know how many babies she also assisted in aborting when that was a path that he was walking out. My birth mother, like many women, was madly in love. My biological father. I now know they dated all throughout high school into college. They were actually engaged to be married when they found themselves facing that unplanned pregnancy with me. And as I told somebody in an interview today, my heart breaks for my biological father and my biological mother. My heart breaks for the men and women like them today who maybe walk out very similar paths to theirs. You see, in their circumstances, they were given no other choice than abortion. My birth mother was a college student at the University of South Dakota, was an athlete, didn't even understand that she was pregnant at the time. Do I think some of that was denial given the circumstances? Of course. But what I do know is that when her mother, my grandmother, learned before she did, just by laying eyes on her, that she was pregnant with me, my birth parents were hastened into that city of South Sioux City, Nebraska, where my birth mother's family lived. And I have family members who now tell me they could hear the windows rattle with the yells that took place. There will be no other choice. This will be taken care of. Imagine being 19, 20, 21 years old and being told you have no choice about this baby's life. Sadly, like so many relationships, this ended the one between my biological parents. Within days of the windows rattling at that house in South Sioux City, I now know my birth mother was then forced into St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, to undergo that saline and infusion abortion that was intended to take my life and forever changed hers. That is me that you see up there on the screen, as you probably gathered all along. This procedure was the most common one performed back in the 1970s. I know some of you who have been engaged in this battle for so long remember the saline infusion abortion. You know, sometimes when I testify before Congress now, they've said, you're irrelevant to the conversation. We don't even perform that abortion procedure anymore. Well, first of all, excuse me. This is always going to be a relevant conversation for any of us, but especially for somebody like me, regardless of what the abortion procedure is. But people sometimes forget what that saline infusion abortion really did do to babies like me and women like my birth mother. That saline infusion abortion that was forced upon her against her will involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding the preborn baby in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald the baby to death until their life was successfully ended. Usually it lasted about 3 days. If the child was fortunate enough, in their words, their life would be ended within about the first 24 hours. And then the rest of those three days were spent inducing labor, with the intent of that deceased child being expelled from the womb. We know through my medical records that I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for 24 hours or 3 days. My birth mother and I were subjected to that abortion for 5. I now know that over that 5-day period, they started to wonder if my birth mother was going to make it out of that hospital alive. That's another one of those dirty secrets from the abortion industry and their lobby, right? They don't talk to you about the baby who is being subjected to the abortion. They don't tell women that their life is endangered by it. That abortion took place at St. Luke's Hospital, not because they were intending for a live birth to happen, but because there is a greater risk to women's health the later in that pregnancy the abortion is occurring. God has this way of working out all the details, though, in his favor, doesn't he? After soaking in that toxic salt solution for 5 days, on the 5th day of that abortion procedure, the feast of the beheading of St. John the Baptist, a little minor detail I've learned in my life, I was accidentally born alive. I think we can give God a round of applause on that one, can't we? Isn't it striking that somebody like me is the epitome of what an unsuccessful abortion looks like? I mean, shouldn't we all be left scratching our heads out here in our culture going, whoa, now wait a minute. I mean, if this healthy, vibrant wife, mother, productive citizen is a unsuccessful abortion, I mean, so shouldn't we consider what a successful abortion is and what it looks like? But we haven't had the opportunity to sow those seeds as powerfully as we can, I think, in our culture. And the abortion industry has successfully controlled the narrative for far too long. But yet here we stand anyway with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, in spite of the control that they've had. And that is the power of God, and that gives me great hope. I know people have a lot of questions about somebody like me. Wait a minute, you soaked for 5 days. How does this happen that you come out alive? I don't have all the answers to that question, but what I can tell you is that by and large, abortionists don't really provide adequate exams. I know we're not super surprised by that news, those of us that are engaged in this work. Again, I think God works out the details for all good. In my circumstances, my abortionist wrote on my medical records, he estimated my birth mother was between 18 and 20 weeks along gestationally. They were delivering enough salt solution to poison and scald me, but it was never enough to kill me. And that is the grace of God. And I wish I could stand here tonight and say that day when I was delivered alive, the day I now celebrate as my birthday, which is also something I would like our culture to consider. Other people get to have a birthday, yet far too many of us have a day that we were accidentally born alive. Our culture needs to reconcile that for a moment as well. But I wish I could stand here tonight and say that when I was delivered alive that day, all of the doctors and nurses cheered just like we are tonight. But if you don't know this about people like me, the abortion industry has given us a very endearing term, if you might say. We're actually called the dreaded complication of abortion. A baby who survives is someone to be dreaded, somebody to be prevented, somebody to be avoided at all costs. And they say that themselves very openly for decades. So when we hear this discussion about legislation and how it saves lives, and even born alive legislation, and people want to come to you and say, that isn't needed, listen to the words of abortionists themselves, and then you tell me how they really feel about babies like me who survive abortions. We know the answer. And sadly, I know the answer to what happened in August of 1977 when they came face to face with me as an unsuccessful abortion. I know that I was initially laid aside at that hospital, not immediately provided medical care, while arguments ensued about what was going to happen to me next. When I first learned my story, and I'm going to share a little bit about that with you tonight so you can understand how I've gotten to this point in my life and in my work. When I first heard my story, I was told that it was my abortionist who gave that demand that I be left to die. And that makes sense, doesn't it? I'm somebody to be avoided and prevented, and someone to be silenced, someone to be pushed into the shadows. But sadly, I now know that it was someone much closer to me who gave that demand. Someone who should have loved me unconditionally. Someone who should have loved my biological mother unconditionally. Her mother. And if you haven't heard these stories, I can tell you I hear them time and time again of how very well-intentioned friends, family members, medical professionals, members of the clergy, right? We can fill in this blank with so many people, continue to make decisions about life and death surrounding abortion, never thinking about the outcome. My grandmother demanded that the nurses that she supervised leave her firstborn granddaughter to die. And I don't shame her for that. I don't fault her for that. I don't condemn her for that. This is a very matter-of-fact story that I have to tell. I have my suspicions about what happened in her life that led her to that place. But what I can tell you is that nothing I have ever learned about her, nothing I've ever learned about my abortionist, who just so happened to move to Nebraska after I failed to die in that abortion, nothing I've ever learned about them has ever changed the reality that they are fellow broken human beings like you and me. And Jesus died for them, just like he did for you and me. And I can tell you, yes, there are days in this journey that have been hard for me. But every single day I am faced with the decision to see other people's humanity. We can be righteously angry about the injustice of abortion, and trust me, man, I am. But yet we can still love the people as fellow broken human beings and pray for them, work alongside them when they are converted, right? Come face to face with them and see their humanity. That is how we win this battle. And I am so grateful that an ordinary person, just like you and me, by the grace of God, did something extraordinary that day. I've been told that she's actually from Nebraska. I don't know that I will ever be able to obtain that 100%, but in my heart, I'm pretty sure she's here. But a tall, blonde nurse whisked me off from that room when I was laid aside and rushed me off to the NICU so that I could be provided medical care. An ordinary person who, by the grace of God, did something extraordinary for me. And how could she have ever known that I would continue to live, that I would go on to know my story and be called by God to be a part of the pro-life movement and get to share her courage, her impact with the world? You have to have hope that in everything you do, everything you say, it makes a difference day in and day out, and of course here in eternity as well. But here I am tonight because this ordinary woman did something that shouldn't be extraordinary, but in the face of what we fight against, this was extraordinary. And that is when the doctors first looked at me and realized that I was much further along gestationally. In fact, the neonatologist remarked in my records, I was probably about 31 weeks gestation. As you see there in the photo, I was a tiny little thing. I weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which really fits with that 31-week mark. You would never know by looking at me tonight that when I was whisked off to the NICU, the prognosis for my life, as you heard in my introduction, was actually quite poor. I was suffering from severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. The doctors even thought I had a fatal heart defect because of the amount of distress I was presenting with. And we live in a culture that still hears those kind of descriptions and puts a quality on that life. Is that a life worth living? And even, is that a life anyone could love? We hear that, right? And I can tell you that my mom and dad didn't hesitate for a moment to open their hearts and their home to me when they received a call from social services about the little girl who had survived a failed abortion and was likely going to suffer from disabilities. My mom and dad traveled to the University of Iowa hospitals where I had been transferred and met me face to face for the first time. And I can tell you, my mom and dad are ordinary people, just like you and me, who by the grace of God did something extraordinary. They said yes, and they loved me into life. My mom and dad will tell you the first moment they laid eyes on me, they thought I was the most beautiful baby they had ever seen. I often joke and say, I've seen the photo, I know. And my mom always says, but miss, you were so beautiful to us. And that's what the world needs, doesn't it? We overcomplicate everything, it seems, in our world, when at the basis, what it is doing that very extraordinary thing of seeing the person in front of us and loving them for who they are, not knowing what the outcome will be for us or for them. And I can tell you, my mom and dad's love radically transformed my life. I went home to them about less than 3 months after surviving that failed abortion. It was a miraculous thing. And I thought I was a very ordinary person growing up in my life. I grew up to know Jesus from my youngest age. I grew up knowing I was adopted. I knew lots of people like me. And all the while, never could I have imagined my parents were keeping their deep, dark secret. They were afraid of ever telling me. They simply wanted me to live my life knowing that I was loved by my biological parents. My mom and dad did a wonderful job of setting that stage with me. But God has this way of bringing the truth to light, doesn't he? And usually in ways and moments that we never see coming. When I was 14 years old, that moment hit like a lightning bolt in my family. My older sister, as a high school student, faced her own unplanned pregnancy. I lovingly call these the when the rubber hits the road moments, right? We have our beliefs, we may be involved in various ministries, and then the rubber hits the road and we kind of go, what? What's gonna happen here? When my parents found out that she was facing that unplanned pregnancy and was actually not sure what she was going to do about the pregnancy, they knew that they were called to do something extraordinary. And they felt like the most important thing they could do was share a story so that she could understand how abortion truly touches people's lives. Maybe you've already figured out what they told her. The younger sister who had survived an abortion. I am happy to tell you that, gosh, that's been what, 33 years ago now, my sister was told the story of my survival. My oldest nephew is about 33-ish. He is a father, he is a member of the military, he's an amazing man. And I praise God that he wasn't another statistic when it comes to abortion. Your conversations matter. When you are shaking in your shoes and thinking, man, I've got a story, I've got a secret, I'm not telling anybody, stop for a second and think about whether God has given you that story for a reason. You never know the impact that it might make. You know, my world came crashing down during an argument with my sister about that time. She let it slip that as a fellow adoptee, she felt like she was more wanted by her biological parents than I was by mine. As you can imagine, for two teenage girls, this was gonna be a pretty epic showdown between the two of us. And mainly by me, right? I was like, what? What is this? And it turned very ominous very quickly, and she encouraged me to ask our parents for more to the story. And I also talked about this in an interview today. I said, you know, never in a million years could I imagine that when I would sit my mom down on a cold October night, expecting to get in trouble for fighting with my sister, that what I would actually hear was the words, Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. There are no words. It's like when you're a little kid and you're on the swing and you fall off and you get the wind knocked out of you and you lay there for a minute trying to figure out what doesn't hurt. That was my night. And that was the night my parents had wanted to avoid so badly. And I think looking back on that night, never could my mom or I have imagined how God would bring about such good. I will not pretend for a moment that this has been easy along this journey. Back then, there was no support from my adoptive parents. Back then, there was nobody for me to turn to. Nobody talked about the fact that babies survive abortions. Tomorrow, you're going to hear me talk at the union about how many of us actually survive. I mean, what would you say if I told you tonight that statistics from Canada would show us that there are thousands of babies who survive abortions here in the United States a year? We should be saddened by that we don't know it as a culture, but I hope that we also find hope in that number, because look at what is continuing to happen in those lives. But back then, there was no one for me to turn to, and I turned my pain inward like so many survivors do, battled against the identity of who I am as a survivor, trying to reconcile it with our society that was communicating to me as a young 14-year-old girl that I had no place to belong, that it was simply my birth mother's right to have that abortion. And what did that mean for me? You don't fit in. You need to be quiet. You need to be ashamed. And I can tell you that is part of what I do with survivors now around the world, is help battle that shame, bring in healing, bring in community, something that we desperately need. But along that journey, I'm so grateful that I learned so much about God and who He created me to be. And I started to have this incredible heart of love and mercy towards my biological parents. You know, I didn't know all of their story back then, but I knew after my anger started to subside and turn to grief, what I knew in my heart is that their lives had to have been forever changed by that abortion. And I first forgave them for that when I was a teenager. And I say first time because I forgive again and again and again. And God ultimately put me out on a journey to find them. I started looking for them when I was about 19. I didn't find them until I was nearly 30. And those were years I needed to live, to learn about God's will and how it doesn't always match up with the plans that we have laid out for our lives. And in the midst of that, I think most people thought I led a really normal life. I ended up moving to Sioux City, Iowa. Iowa, not Nebraska, sorry once again. I moved there to finish my master's degree. I thought, what, Sioux City is a part of my past. I cannot ever even really drive past St. Luke's Hospital without gripping the wheel of my car because it is too much for me. But you know what, this is my past, it's not my present. And of course, then I moved to Sioux City. And I worked in the Sioux City area for many, many years. I have a clinical social work degree. And what I never could have imagined is that as I was starting to move to Sioux City and create this life that I never thought would be my future, God was working in such miraculous ways. God had really put it on my heart that it was time to consider sharing my story with the world, no matter how scared I might be. But I had placed a lot of demands, if I'm being honest with God. I need to find my biological parents first. That would be great. I'd feel better about this. And also, I need to obtain my medical records because we live in a culture that wants to deny that people like me exist. So, Lord, these are my 2 requests. If we could make this happen, I could probably say yes. Some of you have had similar conversations with him, right? We were like, if I'm just being honest, Lord. And of course, God heard my heart and my prayers. And suddenly in 2007, I obtained my medical records. Most survivors don't have them. And you know what? We shouldn't have to fight to be seen and heard in this world. I am tired of survivors being meant to feel ashamed for surviving, for having a voice on this issue, and for being shamed for not having medical records. This is not our choice. This is the abortion industry, and sadly, so much of the medical community that has been impacted by it. But God knew my heart and knew his plan for me. And so I have my medical records. And in them, they say things like a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. There's those words again, right? So fascinating. And as hard as it was to read through those records, I ultimately experienced a lot of joy because in them, they committed a really big mistake. Even bigger than talking about an abortion. They included my birth parents' names. Sorry for any of you medical records clerks in the room. I know somebody's sweating right now. I don't call that a HIPAA violation. I call that divine intervention. How about you, right? My prayer and my heart. And I searched for over 10 years, right? And I had to grapple with God, right? I was a little bit prideful. Like, I got this, Lord. I'm searching. Like, look at me. I'm figuring some things out. And it's like in that day in 2007, God went, are you watching me? Because I can do this. And this is what it looks like. And of course, maybe you would have done the very same thing I did that night. I jumped on the internet and I started searching. And you're never going to guess what I discovered. I was living in the very same city as my biological father. For me to say Sioux City is my past, and definitely not ever my future. He was there all along. Back then I had no idea that their family was from all of those communities, but God knew. And I wish I could be here tonight telling you that I was united with my birth father. But life has this way of continuing to happen, doesn't it? When I found out who he was, I was trying to reach out to him, and I prayed about it for many months before I sent him a letter. Essentially telling him all the things you all know tonight. I'm alive and well, I'm not angry, I'm not bitter. The one thing I wish I would have said was that I love him. I didn't want to scare him away. Little could I have known that I would never receive a response back from him. And as the days turned into weeks, turned into months, and I was dealing with my own whispers in my ear, right? The enemy saying, see, I told you. Nobody wants to hear from you. What I never could have imagined is that there was a much bigger reason. My biological father lost his life about 8 months after I found out who he was. And of course, when I discovered that, I grieved it heavily. My mom and dad are my mom and dad, trust me, nothing will ever change that. But to look for my birth father, be in the same city, and lose him, I questioned God in my grief. And I can tell you that he answered me loud and clear. And if he's never answered you in that place, know that he will. When I questioned him, he said, "Be patient, Melissa, because my plan is much greater than the one you have in mind." And I trusted in that. And as the months unfolded, I got to see God's great plan start to really unfold in my life. I gave birth to our first daughter, Olivia, who is now 15, nearly 16, believe it or not. Some of you who saw her all those years ago, my oldest daughter was born in 2008 at St. Luke's Hospital. Another thing I told God I wouldn't do. I need to stop doing that. Sometimes I'll say things like, "God, I will never move to Hawaii." And it hasn't quite worked out the same way. So if it's worked that way for you, tell me about it later, because it's not the way he works with me. But you know, it was a miraculous, incredible restoration to give birth at that hospital. And trust me, I told God every reason why I wouldn't do it, and he showed up to make it clear that it was his plan of restoration. And in that photo, you see my husband, Ryan, and my youngest daughter, Ava, as well. But right after Olivia was born at St. Luke's Hospital, God continued to move in such a powerful way. After my birth father passed away, his family discovered the letter that I had sent him. And that's how they learned the great secret about why my birth parents' relationship ended. They never knew. They didn't know about the pregnancy or the abortion or the baby who lived. I was so blessed to have my grandfather be a part of my life until just a couple of years ago. One of my great aunts still lives in Sioux City, and she is an incredible part of our family's lives as well. But I lived in the same city as my own grandmother, who was married to my paternal grandfather. I lived there with aunts and uncles, cousins, and most of them could never bring themselves to meet me. And again, I don't share this from a place of condemnation. I want you to understand that this is what abortion does. It changes relationships. It ends them. It impacts families for generations. And so I know my biological family is just still in this process of restoration right now. We are on a path to reconciliation, and I still take hope in that because I know God's not done yet. So if you're in that place of wondering about your own life and maybe that person you need to be reconciled with, know that there is hope to be found in what you're going through. But as I close tonight, I want to share with you something really big that's happened since the last time I was here for your rally. When I was here last time, I had had no contact with my biological mother. As you've heard, I knew who she was. I had had some contact with my maternal grandparents, not knowing the huge role that my grandmother played in that abortion. But back then, I had no contact with her. And I continued to live with hope that maybe someday that would happen. When my family and I moved to Kansas City from Sioux City about 11 years ago, and really we moved for football. Just making sure you're all still listening. I mean, but sort of at this point, it's a pretty good gig. We're pretty happy about it. My kids are. You know, we moved to Kansas City because my husband had been an old Gateway employee, right? Some of you know what this was like in Sioux City. There were no tech jobs after a while in Sioux City. And so my husband and I had this long conversation of where should we go? And my husband said, Kansas City. And I said, Atlanta? And he kept saying, Kansas City. And when we first arrived there, I was thinking, this is not what I was expecting once again, but I feel like this is home. And in a matter of just a few weeks, I received an email that proved to me that it really is home in every great way. A member of my birth mother's family reached out to me, and that's how I learned all the great secrets about my grandmother forcing the abortion, demanding I be left to die. And sadly, I learned that there was one final huge secret that even my adoptive parents didn't know. And that is that my birth mother had spent over 30 years of her life believing the abortion was successful. It's like something out of a movie, isn't it? A movie that Hollywood would never want to write. A story that I didn't intend to live. nor did she. They kept it a secret. She didn't know if I was a little boy or a little girl, and yet they saw her suffering over the years, and I have to believe that in their heart, they never intended harm. But like so many of us, looked upon one sin and one lie and yet another piece of shame and guilt built upon another, and you wake up and wonder, how do I ever start breaking this one down? But God broke it down in 2010, around that time when she found out that I had survived. When we moved to Kansas City and I learned all these things from her cousins, they shared one final secret with me that has changed my life in every good way. Where do you think my birth mother lives? Kansas City, along with one of my half-sisters. That is my biological mother, Ruth, that you see there on the screen. Ruth and I started communicating in 2013, didn't meet face-to-face until 2016 because we had a lot of healing to do, and by we, I mostly mean she. She questioned how I could ever love her. She questioned how I could ever forgive her family. And so I spent years building walls of trust and love with her before we met face-to-face for the first time. Just this Christmas, my mom and dad met Ruth for the first time. And I can tell you, that is something that I never saw coming in any of our lives. My children are raised knowing Ruth is just another one of their grandmothers. In fact, we talk on a weekly basis. If my kids were here tonight, and trust me, my mom and dad know this, so if you ever run into them, don't be afraid to tell them. My kids know that Grandma Ruth is the grandma who actually gives the best presents. I often say, she's just making up for lost time, right? Really, I mean, mom and dad, it's cool. But that's what I love about our circumstances, right? God writes straight with these crooked lines, these lines that seem so crooked that they could never be straightened. God brings about restoration and reconciliation in ways that we never could imagine. And that's what I want you to take away from tonight. When the battle seems hard and you are giving it your all, I want you to have hope. Knowing that there is always hope in this battle and that God is doing infinitely more than we could ever imagine. So thank you so much for being a part of everything that is happening in Nebraska, throughout our nation, and just know you are not fighting alone. God bless you so much for being here tonight. I know we're going a little over in time, y'all, but I have the great opportunity as we close tonight, before Father comes up and closes us in prayer. I have the opportunity tonight to point you at your tables to an important envelope. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may have covered it with your napkins. We're at that point of the evening, right? You're like, what? What is it? Friends, if you're at your table and you find one, pass it around to somebody who can't find theirs, right? It's covered by their napkin, it's under their plate. Pass them out. These are your opportunity to make not only nights like this possible, tomorrow's rally possible, but the day in and day out efforts of Nebraska Right to Life possible. Those educational efforts, right, you can see here on the envelope, you can give to the Life Trust Fund, which is tax deductible. You can also give to Nebraska Right to Life, which is non-tax deductible. Some of you with businesses might want to do both. I encourage you, whether you fill this out tonight or you take it with you to fill out later, prayerfully consider, not only with your time and your talents, how you serve in this movement, but how you can give your financial treasure. Because as someone who is engaged in this battle, not just in the day in and day out, but also in ballot initiatives, I know how much your support is needed. So prayerfully consider tonight or going forward how you can support Nebraska Right to Life or the Trust Fund and send that back to them. Thank you so much again for being here tonight. Father, how have I lost you? There you are.
I think we should still keep clapping for a moment, because one thing real quick that I found most fascinating about Melissa's story is that she brought us back to one central focus in that whole story. God writes straight lines out of crooked lines. God does this, because how many times do we mess it up, right? God does this. And I'm not just saying this as a Catholic priest. I don't even know what religion Melissa is.
I'm a convert.
Yes, she's a convert. From what? From what? We'll talk later, she said. So you know, my mother was a convert from Southern Baptist, so I don't know if that helps. Oh, it's not that, okay. She said. But anyways, my point is that, right? That's what I loved about your talk mostly, right? You brought us back to that one central reality. The one person who can do all things when we can't. Right? And so, Melissa, just another round of applause for you and your beautiful family.